Hey guys, so in this video I'll be going over Unit 5, the free response question number 1. Okay, so again, I'm separating the questions into separate videos just to stay organized. So I'll do question 1 in this video and then I'll do a separate video for question 2. Now, question 1 from Unit 5, really was not that complicated. It had a few parts, I think A through D it looks like, okay? But they were very simple, very quick little parts as long as you understood, as long as you had a good understanding of what Unit 5 was all about. So Unit 5 is called Control Structures and Methods, okay? And they give us a class here, and the class that they give us is called Invitation. So there's some sort of party that's going to happen, and there's this class called Invitation that has two fields, the host name and the address, okay? And then in this free response question, they want you to write some getter methods, some setter methods, and some constructors, but pretty straightforward for the most part, okay? So let's get started. Like I said, we have this class called Invitation, that has two fields. Both are strings, right? So the two fields are host name and address, which are both strings. Then we have this constructor, right? So public invitation. So remember, how do we know that this is a constructor? Well, it's actually pretty easy. The constructor always has the same name as the class. So my class is called Invitation, and so public invitation just means that this is a constructor for invitation, right? And remember, a constructor just initializes your fields. So we have two fields here, and this constructor is initializing them. So it's initializing them by taking two parameters. They're calling them n and a, right? So remember, you could technically use the same variable name. So you could have used, they could have used here instead of string n, they could have used host name, string host name, and then string, instead of string a, they could have used string address, but they tell you not to use the same variable names just to avoid confusion. So they chose to go with n and a, and now they're initializing the first field, host name, to equal n, the parameter n, and address to equal the parameter a. Okay, so nothing crazy here. So like I said, this is a pretty straightforward problem. Okay, let's look at part A. Again, I have these answers already typed out, and I'll just be going over them one by one. I could technically type these out as I go along, but I chose to just do them ahead of time and then just focus on explaining them to you after having done them. Okay, so part A. It says write a method for the invitation class that returns the name of the host. Okay, so this is a method that's returning the name of the host or host name. So it's just going to give us back the name of the host. Okay, so hopefully you realize that this is a getter method because it's returning information, it's getting information. Okay, so let's go to my workspace. Okay, so this very beginning is just, I actually copied and pasted the class just so I could have it. So this, these highlighted lines are not part of whatever you would type for this next solution. Okay, so let's focus on part A. Here's part A. Okay, so I'll zoom in a little bit so you guys can see a little bit better. So notice I commented and I wrote it's a getter method for host name. Okay, so it's a getter method and it's returning host name, and host name is a string. So I have public string. So I have string because it's returning a string, right? And since it's a getter method, since it's returning one of the fields, I called it get host name. You could have just called it get name, but I think host name is better because it's more specific. And remember, getter methods don't need any parameters because you're just getting some information, okay? And all you had to do for this getter method is return host name, right? Because all this is doing is returning the host name to the screen. That's it. That was all you had to do for part A. Okay? Let's look at part B. Oops. Okay, part B. Write a method for the invitation class that accepts the parameter and uses it to update the address for the event. Okay, so this is going to set the address to something else, right? So we're initializing the address here with this constructor, but they want us to write a method in case we want to change the address, so it's no longer A, right? So here's what I did, part B. Okay, let's take a look. So it's not returning anything because it's just, let's see, what did it say they want us to do? It updates the address. So it's not going to return anything to the screen. It's not going to return anything for us to use. It's just going to update some information. So that's why I'm using void. It's not returning anything. So public void. Okay, I called it set address because that made sense to me. And notice that in the directions they wrote, it accepts a parameter. So it accepts something, right? So it's going to accept a new address. So the variable I used, I called it new address. You could have called it new A. I recommend you use variable names that the grader will be able to follow easily, right? You don't want to use some like random XYZ variable where the grader might not know what you meant. So I would say try to be as clear as possible with your variables as to what they are representing. So since we're setting the address to something else, it made sense to me to call it new address, and it's also a string, right? So I'm just going to take my field address and set it equal to my new address because I'm changing the address to whatever this parameter was, which is new address. Okay, so that's part B. All right, let's move on to part C. See how quickly these are? They're not very difficult. So as long as you understand, you know, classes and how they work and constructors, you should be okay. And if you're having trouble with this, I recommend you review the whole unit again, unit 5 on College Board. Okay, part C. Write a method for the invitation class that will accept the name of a person who will be invited as a string parameter and return a string consisting of the name of the person being invited along with the name of the host and location of the event. For example, if the host name is Karen, the party location is 1234 Walnut Street, and the person invited is Cheryl, the method should return a string in the following format. Dear Cheryl, please attend my event at 1234 Walnut Street, and see you then, comma, Karen. Okay, so a couple of things. So this is a method. It accepts a parameter, which is the name of someone, which is that's the person who's invited, so the guest. And then it returns a string. Okay, so let's work with that. Part C. Okay, so public string, all right, so I put string because it's returning a sentence, right? So public string is because it's going to return a sentence like the example they gave us. Okay, I called my method a formal invite. I guess you could have called it formal message or invitation message or whatever, you know, that's not that important. I just came up with formal invite. And remember, this invite takes in a parameter, which is the guest that you're inviting, right? And that guest, their name is a string, so string guest is what I called it. Okay, and then it's gonna return this concatenated string or message. So I kind of followed their format, right? Because that's the example you should go by. So dear, now be careful with your spacing. I think that's important, right? So here I included a space. So dear guest, okay, because that's who you're inviting, right? Then I added the sentence, right? So I made sure to just put spaces and commas and things where they're supposed to go so that I can get the correct output. So it says, please attend my event at, oops, see, I forgot a plus here. Okay. And then I'm adding my address here. right? The address is just a field. So I'm using my variable address. Plus a period. Yeah, I forgot some pluses, so that's my mistake. Actually, we could do this. Okay, then I have see you then, comma, and then I added the host name, which is just a field, right? Because that's who's signing this invitation. It's you, the host, right? So host name and then plus period. Okay, so that was part C. And finally, part D. Okay, a student has written the following one-parameter constructor to be included in the invitation class. The method is intended to construct a new invitation object that sets address to the value of the parameter and sets host name to the default name host. The constructor does not work as intended. Okay, so if you look at what they have, it actually is almost correct, right? So this constructor is taking in one parameter, just this string called address. Now, the issue is that they have address equals address. You can't do that. And the problem with that is because the parameter address is the same variable as your field, the computer will get confused when you try to say address equals address. So it doesn't know which address each of these is referring to. So because you're using a parameter that has the same variable name as your field, this is where you have to use the this dot notation. So if you look at my constructor, so I only had to fix one little thing. This dot address equals address. What that does is it guarantees that the computer knows that this dot address is referring to your field. So it's saying initialize the address field to the address parameter. I hope that makes sense, okay? Otherwise, the second half is fine. Host name equals quote unquote host is fine because they only wanted one parameter in the directions, that's what it said. And the host name, they wanted it defaulted to host, so it's always host. It's never anything else. So we don't have to include it as a parameter. We just have to set it equal to the string host because that's the default they wanted. So the only mistake in what they showed us is that they didn't use the this dot notation. Now, in the constructor that they had, they didn't use the this notation. They could have, but they didn't need to because the field name and the parameter name were not the same. So there was no way that the computer would get confused. But here, since you're using the same variable, you do have to use the this dot notation. Okay? I think that's it for number 1. Okay, so not bad at all. I'm hoping that the questions on this AP exam will be simple enough like this, and I feel like they might be just because they're not giving you a lot of time, but don't quote me on that. Hopefully that helps you guys. Me going over these questions has been helping. Like I said, look out for the other videos. All right.